Everyone, I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program and the Frontier Europe Initiative fellow. I'm very happy today to welcome you to today's discussion. We're going to be discussing the implications of the current tension between Turkey and Greece. And I'm sure many of you have been following this. In the past weeks, we have seen the two countries escalate their war of words, and analysts warn about the risk of current tension escalating into a conflict between the two NATO allies. And that prospect, the prospect of a conflict, is not too far-fetched, given the fact that Turkey and Greece in the past came close to war 3 times. But the latest row began when Turkey accused Greece of locking onto Turkish fighter jets with its Russian-made S-300 anti-aircraft missile systems over the Eastern Mediterranean during a NATO mission recently. Greece dismissed Turkish claims and accused Turkey of violating its airspace, and both countries lodged complaints with NATO about the incidents. Later, President Erdogan, Turkish President Erdogan, doubled down, and he threatened to use force, a military force against Greece. And how serious is he? Both Erdogan and Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis are facing elections next year in 2023, and they're both facing significant challenges. So do they see escalation as a useful tool to mobilize their nationalist bases ahead of elections? What would further escalation mean for NATO unity at a time when the West is trying very hard to confront Russia and present a unified NATO front? And what can Europe and the United States do to ease the tension? So to answer these questions and more, I'm joined by a great group of panelists, and you can find their detailed bios on our website. Alper Coşkun, he is a former Turkish diplomat and a senior fellow with Carnegie's Europe program. And I have Yanis Grigoriadis. He's an associate professor and Jean Monnet Chair of European Studies at Bilkent University, which is based in Ankara. And I have Ryan Gingeras. He's a professor of national security affairs at Naval Postgraduate School. And welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I would like to start with a very general question, and that is why are we having this tension now? I know I talked about how these countries have been historical, have been rivals for decades, but is there something specific at this present juncture that make this tension more understandable? Is it domestic political calculations? I mentioned that the two leaders are facing elections next year. Or is it the Ukraine crisis, or are there larger geopolitical dynamics at play, such as tightening ties between US and Greece, or Turkey's strained ties with the Western world? And please feel free to join. Anyone can jump in to answer.
Let me try and kick off, if I may. Gönül, thank you for the kind introduction, and greetings to everyone who is participating in this. Also to my co-panelists, I'm very happy to be here. Gönül, thank you for organizing this. I think this is an important topic, and it's important to try and make sense of what's happening. You know, in my view, there are a couple of dimensions. First, something that we can refer to as business as usual, and you alluded to that. You have two politicians in the form of Mitsotakis in Greece and Erdogan in Turkey that are shrewd politicians. They're facing their own challenges internally, and I think you know, utilizing sensitive issues like this that appeal to the publics at large is business as usual in the case of both countries. So there's nothing new or refreshing, I should say, in that respect, that is something that I think we need to bear in mind and understand. But there are new dynamics and important dynamics that I think make the situation potentially more dangerous than in the past. And you alluded to unfortunate experiences that Turkey and Greece have had. I personally witnessed one of those when the two countries almost went to war in 1996 over what in Turkey we refer to as Kardak, what the Greeks refer to as the Imia, the islets, the two rocks. And, that was a very close call, and one that obviously should not be repeated in any form or fashion between the two countries. Now, the novelty that I see at play here is on both sides. Let me start with Greece, to the extent that I can share my views with you. I think it's quite clear that Greece feels more emboldened. There are two schools of thought, I'm told, in Greece. One argues that given Turkey's isolation in the West, in the region at large, and given the comparative success of Greece in terms of nurturing relations that had traditionally been problematic, for example, with the United States, because you have a very strong, if you will, left stream in Greece that has traditionally been opposed to deepened interaction and cooperation with Greece. My suspicion is that that is still there, probably, but over the years, Greece has been able to overcome that, at least in practice, and the increased cooperation that it now has with the United States. The agreement that it has signed with France, with the Mutual Defense Support Clause, for example, and the way in which Greece is interpreting that, referring to it as something that even goes beyond Article 5 within NATO, and also speaking of it as a guarantee as far as the challenges that it faces in the Eastern Mediterranean, without referring to Turkey, obviously implying Turkey. These are all manifestations of the fact that Greece feels more emboldened. And I think it has put it into practice rather recently. The incident that you mentioned, the locking of the radar on the Turkish F-16s during a NATO flight, I'm told by numerous Turkish sources that it did take place. You made the point that Greece denies this, and I know that as well. And then that was not an isolated incident. In a matter of, I think, a week or so, there were multiple incidents of similar nature in which Turkey felt that Greece was acting in a provocative fashion in the Aegean. This will come as news to my Greek friends who will argue that it's Greece that is provoking Turkey in the Aegean. I understand their perspective in that regard, but this is exactly how Turkey has seen it. And it has been seen, I think, as a very marked escalation on the part of Greece. Now, when I look at the chronology of events, it was only in March that Prime Minister Mitsotakis was in Turkey. They had a cordial meeting with Erdogan. But I think there was a very significant turning point after his address to Congress and his visit to the United States. And President Erdogan doesn't hide the fact that he's an emotional leader. He reacts emotionally. I think that was one incident where he took to heart the turn, if you will, that he personally perceived in Mitsotakis' approach to him, which he interpreted as an insincere move, I think. And from then on, you saw the rhetoric going up. So I think the Turkish reaction was not one by design to escalate in this particular context, but a cumulative effect of these issues. One last point, obviously the rhetoric that President Erdogan deployed is unhelpful in terms of trying to explain what Turkey's legitimate concerns are as far as the disagreements with Greece and the Aegean. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and for our audience, when Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis he spoke on the Hill, he addressed the Congress. He urged the Congress not to sell F-16s to Turkey, and that was particularly infuriating for President Erdogan. Anyone else? Yanis, what is your take on this? Why are we seeing this tension escalate now?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Gönül. It's a great pleasure to be with our co-panelists this evening in Europe and morning or afternoon in the United States. I think there are a number of reasons that have been kind of contributing to this sharp escalation. If we take a distance and look into the discovery of hydrocarbons in the Eastern Mediterranean, which in a sense triggered new interest in the issue of delimitation of maritime zones in the region, which of course is a bilateral dispute between Greece and Turkey, but also involves the Cyprus problem. So for some years, we hoped that hydrocarbons could become a trigger for conflict resolution in Cyprus because it would provide some additional revenue that would help finance the agreement. It would give certain incentives to key players in the region, including Greece and Turkey, to agree on a compromise solution. Unfortunately, this opportunity was missed a few years ago in Crans-Montana, Switzerland. And ever since, the Cyprus problem kind of turned this hydrocarbon issue from a trigger to solution to a trigger to further conflict, because the two sides continued their policies, and Turkey behaved in a way that didn't recognize the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus. And this led Turkey to isolation on the European and international level. And in addition to that, of course, we had the Libyan-Turkish Memorandum, which was another crucial point in the deterioration between in Greek-Turkish relations, because Turkey found a government, and this is the GNA government in Tripoli, right, that was willing to sign a maritime delimitation agreement, completely ignoring the maritime zones of Greek islands. And this is not only about Megisti Castellorizo or a small Greek rock, it is about Crete, Rhodes. And this kind of brought the tension to a completely new level. I will agree with Mr. Coşkun in what he said, that the leader-to-leader relationship is another interesting parameter, because Turkish foreign policy has become increasingly personalistic over the last couple of years. There was never a good rapport, good chemistry between the two leaders, the Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Erdogan. There was an important attempt to build some better relations in the meeting already mentioned, but things went rapidly worse a few weeks later. And we came to a point whereby we have an escalation, not only on the verbal level and of the threats or overflights. And the Greek media report numerous overflights over Greek islands, over the Greek airspace, or over the Greek territorial waters. But apart from that, there was a very severe escalation when it came to the discussion about the demilitarization of some of the Aegean islands. This is, of course, an issue that Turkey tries to put on the table, while Greece is considering that this is not something to be discussed with Turkey. But linking this issue with Greece's sovereignty over the Aegean islands, saying that if Greece doesn't comply with its obligations as Turkey understands them, this means that Greece's sovereignty over these islands can be cancelled or can be disputed by Turkey. This brought this escalation to a new dimension. So we've been, of course, affected by the geopolitical developments in the region. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine had added a new dimension to that, because it exposed NATO's soft spot in Greece and Turkey, right? So this is also raising a lot of concerns internationally, how NATO can be successful in responding to the challenge that is facing by Russia if the relations between two of the most important military powers of NATO in the region is undermined by their long-standing disputes. So in that respect, we are in a critical moment, in my opinion, and it is very important to highlight the importance of maintaining channels of communication and dialogue, because the countries may agree to disagree on a number of issues. It might not be an opportune moment to discuss conflict resolution, because as you mentioned, Gönül, we do have elections coming, and let me add the elections in the Republic of Cyprus as well. So it's not two, it's 3 elections upcoming. So this is not an appropriate environment for this. And let me add another point to conclude. I think it's also important to spot that President Erdogan's rhetoric tries to detract attention from a domestic political situation in Turkey, mainly the situation of the economy and the difficulties that the Turkish people is facing with inflation and all the other economic difficulties that have dominated Turkey's domestic politics. And I think he's also keen on trying to build a picture whereby foreign policy is going to be his preferred field for the election campaign. So he wants to shift attention to this. And he also is interested in highlighting a picture whereby foreign powers are trying to use Greece against Turkey. So in a sense, this is a discourse that has appeared time and again in many pro-government newspapers. And apparently, this is going to continue in the coming weeks and months as we come close to the election. But I do hope that this doesn't lead to further escalation, because the region has enough conflicts already. And it is important for all actors that try to keep this situation under control to do their part so that things don't get worse.
Well, Yanis, before I turn to you, Ryan, I'm sorry I forgot to mention another hat you're wearing, and that is Yanis is also a senior research fellow and head of the Turkey program at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. And I also forgot to mention to the audience that if you want to ask a question at any time during this panel, please feel free to do so, and you can use the Q&A function on your screens. So, Yanis, you made 2 points that I want to go back to later in the discussion, and those are, you talked about Erdogan's domestic political calculations. The same could be applied to Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis. Nationalist sentiments run high in both countries, and foreign policy can come in handy at a time when both leaders are losing ground in the polls. And the second point I want to discuss, and this is of personal interest to me, is the question of whether Erdogan could actually, he has used foreign policy masterfully to consolidate the nationalist base, but can he do that again? Is nationalism still a useful tool, given the fact that he's facing way too many problems and the nationalist base is now a lot more fragmented? When he launched incursions into Syria starting from 2016, and he managed to monopolize power using a foreign conflict. So can he do that in the Greek case? So I want to go back to those points, but before that, Ryan, please jump in and let us know what you think about the timing.
Oh, thank you. First of all, again, let me reiterate again my thanks for the invitation. It's great to be on such a wonderful panel this morning. I think generally all the data points that Yanis and Ambassador Chushkin mentioned, I think are accurate in terms of describing and I think setting out the core events that I think add to the urgency of the current situation. What I would add, though, is that some of the incidents that we've described, whether it's drilling ships, the issue of the exploration of natural gas or oil, or even the targeting of Greek or Turkish aircraft, these are things that are not without precedent. In fact, some of these are these sorts of incidents have occurred for quite a long time. In some cases going back to the 1970s. I think, or in some cases even longer, going back to the 50s. I think that first and foremost, it's important to recognize that there has been long an ebb and flow to the ways in which Turkey and Greece have interacted vis-a-vis the Aegean. If you were to ask me though, where if you were to pick one thread that I think leads to a kind of crescendo, I would go back about a decade to the first popularization of the notion of the Mavi Vatan, or the Blue Homeland. And I think this is really important because I think it reframed the issue of the Aegean specifically for not just simply those who are foreign policymakers or senior civilian leaders in Ankara, but also for broad swaths of the military as well as even society at large. And that it reframed the idea of the Aegean beyond just sort of isolated issues of disagreement with Greece, but something much more profound, which is the idea of Turkey's insoluble rights to territory. And I think that those of you who are familiar with kind of the broad strokes of Turkish history, I mean, there is nothing more sacred in Turkish life and in Turkish political life specifically than soil, than the preservation of the unity of the country's territorial sovereignty. And I think the reframing of the Aegean issue in this sort of language, began to inspire people to pay attention to it in a new kind of way, and in a new sort of zero-sum sort of way. And I think it also alerted people and it excited people to think more specifically about maritime policy and about the broader implications of Turkey's interests in its near abroad at sea. And I think, if you consider the fact that, this framework, has now become essential to the ways in which commentators in public debate in Turkey across the entire Turkish political spectrum, but also in the ways in which senior leaders talk about the problem or the various problems that beset Turkey and Greece, specifically within the case of the Aegean, also, obviously within the Eastern Mediterranean as well. There is this, in this sense of new urgency and a new sense of resilience in terms of trying, in attempting to see the policy, see some sort of resolution to Turkey's favor. I'd add to that too, and I'd put some, a point raised here by Yannis, that the specific statement first made by Çavuşoğlu, Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu, in January regarding the debatability of Greek sovereignty over the islands. This represented, I think, a pretty dramatic escalation, at least rhetorically. And it points, in my mind, to a kind of rhetorical benchmark that I think is, far more ominous than, the incidental contact of Greek Coast Guard vessels and ships in the Aegean, or the targeting of warplanes or what have you. I think that this, to me, seems to set the table for a far more dramatic kind of escalation in the stakes within the Aegean as a whole.
Thanks, Ryan. And I think what that did, embracing the blue homeland doctrine, what it did for President Erdogan was, at a time when he wanted to consolidate power, when he was relying on the nationalists, he could, in a way, establish polish his nationalist credentials. So from a pragmatic point of view, embracing that basically meant signaling to his base that he was the most nationalistic leader in Turkish political history, and he used that phrase. So before we dig deeper, Ryan, I want to stay with you and ask you about the historical background. Can you give us a brief rundown of issues that have poisoned relations between Turkey and Greece, but very briefly? I mean, I know it's difficult, but please do your best, because then I want to delve deeper into the domestic context and also regional repercussions of this tension.
I've tried to rehearse this answer, and I'm going to do my best to kind of keep it short. Anyway, yeah, I mean, you could start lots of different places in trying to, set out a beginning, middle, and potential end for where this crisis has been and is going. I mean, I think I would flag a couple important dates, events, and implications, and I think the most fundamental of which is that in the early 20th century, specifically in 1913, the Kingdom of Greece first annexed the major islands of the Aegean, notably Chios and Lesbos, which created this sort of set the foundation for this very specific dynamic in which you have, the existence of sovereign Greek territory, buttressing, the Anatolian mainland, and that, set out in, this was something that was recognized very early on. It created a certain type of set of security conditions, vis-a-vis traffic, vis-a-vis internal security within Anatolia, as a result of Greece's close proximity, on these islands. And so I think this is sort of, if you kind of follow internal discussion within Turkey, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is, certainly the starting point for the ways in which lots of Turks talk about it. But it didn't necessarily, this territorial or, kind of this political, the makings of this political geography, didn't determine or, didn't set in stone, a pattern of escalation. There was a long period of rapprochement between Turkey and Greece, which began to deteriorate, as early as the late 1940s, when Greece annexed the Lebanese from Italy. And along that, it highlighted, going forward, a set of conditions, within the treaties, first between Turkey and Greece, but then between Greece and Italy over the administration of the island. And it set, forward these benchmarks that remain very much a part of us today over issues of territorial sovereignty of the islands, the extent of, maritime rights, the extent of, the conditions of demilitarization. Not that I wish to go into those things in great detail, but those things were what, came as a result of these different agreements, first in the 1920s, then in the 1940s. And I think if you're going to talk about sort of this period of escalation and confrontation, to points just short of war, this is something that goes back to the mid-1950s. And, it should be said, though, that Greece, and Turkey's confrontation within the Aegean, for the most part, has been a kind of side effect of tensions over Cyprus. Yes. But through through this entire process, we do see the development of these very specific points of disagreement, that have become, part and parcel of the way this is debated today. Again, these issues of airspace rights, the issues of maritime sovereignty, the issue of of the continental shelf, issue of militarization. Now, hydrocarbons enter into the issue around the early 1970s, with the with the discovery, of energy deposits within the Aegean. But I think, one thing that, certainly is a rather different, set of conditions, if we were to compare and contrast the 70s, 80s, and 90s with now, is that, processes of, de-escalation and resolution, or at least a freezing of tensions, came about through third-party intervention, specifically on the part of the United States, but also in the degree to which senior Turkish and Greek leaders were able to communicate with one another and be able to at least put some degree, tensions on ice. And that has changed rather markedly, rather recently. And I think, the most important sort of moment in this sort of saga is what happened in the spring when Erdogan basically, kind of rejected even the existence of Prime Minister Mitsotakis. And so I think, through it all, I think that, for those who even follow this somewhat passively, I mean, these are issues that are long-standing. But I think where we come back to is, what this, moment means in terms of, I think, in my opinion, what this means existentially for Turkey as an emerging state, as a state with pretty grand ambitions as an emerging power. And I think, if I was to say, sort of to cut away the fat and identify, what history means to the present, I would say that there is now more than ever a real lack of patience in Ankara in terms of the existence of these tensions. And I think that given the fact that next year is the anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic, I think adds to the sense of urgency in Ankara and dealing very specifically with this issue.
Yeah, you did a great job, Ryan. Thank you. And I know for many people who've been watching President Erdogan's foreign policy moves recently, it might be difficult to believe this, but actually relations with Greece under his rule, they weren't always. Tension was not always there. I don't know if you've seen it, but someone posted a tweet recently on Twitter showing a video where Greek Prime Minister Karamanlis was a wedding witness for President Erdogan's daughter's wedding, and he walked to the stage with a Greek song, and that was in 2004. So in 2004. Erdogan was very much a beloved leader by Greek politicians, because that was when he was ready to compromise on the Cyprus question for his own reasons. So that was always an angle. I mean, what Erdogan wanted in terms of domestic politics, which brings me to my next question. And I want to turn to Alper, because he's, I think, Alper was, until recently, you served as a diplomat and you covered NATO, maritime jurisdiction affairs, as well as Euro-Atlantic security and defense. So I think you're best placed to talk about how the Turkish side sees things and what they want from the Greek side. So Alper, over to you.
I don't envy the role that you gave Ryan a second ago, but your flattering pitch makes my responsibility a little difficult as well. I appreciate that. A couple of things, first of all, I think Ryan hit it on the head. The lack of patience in Ankara and the sense of urgency is increasing in terms of the need to sort of deal with the challenges that Ankara sees as far as its relations with Greece is concerned. And this also includes the Cyprus issue and then the Eastern Mediterranean issues at large. That sense of urgency is on the rise. But of course, we're always following the headlines, the noise that breaks through a greater picture that is sitting idly there. For example, the Mavi Vatan issue. Again, Ryan's right. It's seemingly turned into a mainstream issue in Turkey. And of course, it depends on how you pitch the notion of Mavi Vatan. It can be pitched in a very benign manner, or it can be pitched in an aggressive manner. But the bottom line is that really a reflection, the Mavi Vatan concept, of where Turkey is going politically, strategically, in terms of its relations with Greece? Rhetorically, maybe it may seem so, but when you look at, for example, the Kadir Has University's recent research, only 13% of the public knows what Mavi Vatan is. So even the utilization of that for populistic tendencies has a small appeal, thankfully, still in Turkey. And I think that is one of the novelties or the comparative issues that we have to bear in mind. Traditionally, and for understandable reasons, the perception of Turkey has been a more prioritized challenge in Greece than issues related to Greece have been in Turkey. That's been changing a little bit in Turkey as well, despite the comment that I just made about Mavi Vatan. And I think there is an increased focus among the Turkish public at large in terms of how and where relations with Greece are going. And I think that is not just a function of our relationship with Greece, but it's a function of the implication of what is seen as Greek policies that are impacting on Turkey beyond Turco-Greek relations. The United States is a perfect example. The European Union is a second perfect example, where if you ask any Turk on the street, the Greek policy up until recently has been to express rhetorical support for Turkey's full EU membership, which personally I never believed was sincere, because that is the biggest comparative advantage that Greece has, politically speaking, against Turkey. Now, I think Greece has changed that posture. Greece is trying to utilize its EU membership, and that started particularly with the migrant issue, to build a wall, if you will, against Turkey that never envisages Turkey becoming a part of Europe. And now, after these recent upticks in rhetorical aggressive behavior between Turkey and Greece, you see Greece not mentioning it openly, but in the letter that Dendias sent, for example, to the UN, to NATO, and to the EU, without referring to Turkey, he's casting Turkey in the same light as Russia is perceived in the conflict with Ukraine. So viewed from Ankara, it's a clear attempt on the part of Greece, and there are historical examples to this as well, of Greece trying to bandwagon, if you will, Greece sympathizers against Turkish interests. And so I don't know if the sense of urgency and the nationalistic sentiments behind Mavi Vatan came first, or if this perception is what triggered it, and it's really not important, but this is a vicious cycle that we're talking about. And I think if one were to take a step back, European history and world history is full of the mistake in trying to alienate a challenge, in this case, Turkey, as far as Greece is concerned, as opposed to finding a way to talk about these issues. Now, Turkey hasn't been helping that with its rhetoric, and Ryan mentioned the fact that Erdogan, after Mitsotakis' visit to Washington, said, I don't even recognize him anymore. That's obviously not the way to go. Turkey and Greece have been sitting down in these exploratory talks where Greece will not admit, but there's been talks on a lot more issues than just the ones that Greece refers to, the continental shelf and so on. And there were times where Turkey and Greece were very close to a comprehensive solution, similar to the situation in Cyprus, for example, during the Annan peace talks. So all those close successes but never fulfilled attempts, I think, have aggravated Turkey's sense of urgency. And this has come together with Turkey's sense of isolation and the way in which Erdogan runs foreign policy, which, and I'll link into what Anna said as well, I think that's absolutely true. You know, in the current circumstances in Turkey, where about 86% of the population, an overwhelming proportion of the society that includes AKP supporters, believe that the economy is being mismanaged. So foreign policy tricks are not going to be a big enough bunny that can come out of the hat to change the trends going into the elections. As far as NATO is concerned, you know, you asked me that as well. This is a terrible scenario that Turkey and Greece would go to a conflict, especially when the alliance is trying to build its cohesion in the face of the war against Ukraine. And I think the US is a little bit missing in action. It's only staying behind the scenes. The NATO Secretary General has always offered his good offices. I think more traction in those fields would be helpful at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alper. Yanis, I want to turn to you to get to, I'll ask you the same question. How does the Greek side view things?
Let me start by responding to some of the points you made, which I find quite interesting. You mentioned that Erdogan used to be rather friendly towards Greece for many years. This is true, and actually the opposition used to criticize him for many years for failing to put Turkish claims against Greece in a profound manner. And it's also very interesting to see that many in Greece would have feared some Turkey's like unfriendly acts towards Greece during the peak of the economic crisis, which never happened as well. So now Greece is in a much better shape economically, diplomatically, and politically, and is able to reclaim some of the influence in the region that was lost during the years of the economic crisis. So to that degree, I can see how there is some sort of reaction by Turkey in that respect. Of course, I do think that Turkish overtures throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, Libya, and Syria, in the Balkans, and of course, Mavi Vatan as a new doctrine has made enormous damage to the relationship. Let me highlight here that Mavi Vatan was never introduced officially until after the failed coup attempt and the reshuffling in the ranks of Turkish military that was linked to that.
Yes.
So we do have a completely new environment in that respect. On the other hand, as Ambassador Joshkun mentioned, the public opinion appears to be not affected. In addition to the very good research by Kadir Has University, there was a recent poll by Metropol whereby a clear majority of the Turkish public refused to call Greeks enemies. So they kind of clearly said that we don't see the Greek people and Greece as an enemy in this, which of course goes very much against all the rhetoric that we've been trying to dissect it, to explore in our conversation today. But I do think that there is a difficult situation when it comes to the role of the opposition. To the extent that the opposition tries to avoid shifting attention to foreign policy, it ends to bid on all the Turkish nationalist positions, which of course some of them, as I just said, were introduced by the opposition parties at some point in the past. So in that respect, trying to keep attention into the economy makes the Turkish opposition take positions that would corner Turkey into a very intransigent position. So in a sense, nobody disputes Mavi Vatan on the public debate in Turkey. So it has become a sort of a consensus, at least for the parties, with exception of HDP maybe. But apart from that, this is understood in Greece, and I'm coming to my part of the answer, how Greece looks into this, as escalation of threat. Ever since we kind of forget how Greek-Turkish relations started in the 1930s, it is important to add that we started going through a period of anniversaries in Greek-Turkish relations. So from 1920 to 1923, these anniversaries are understood differently in Greece and Turkey for obvious reasons, but they provide fuel for new sort of aggressive comments and remarks on both sides. But having said that, it is remarkable how 10 years later, Greece and Turkey were able to sign a peace of friendship agreement, and they were together against the threat of Italy. Italy was the real kind of revisionist power in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. It's interesting how the security interests of both countries came together, and this was confirmed with their membership of NATO in the early 1950s. So, as Ryan said very correctly, it's Cyprus that blows this up, and eventually there is a spillover into a number of bilateral Greek-Turkish disputes that now constitute the sort of the portfolio of Greek-Turkish disputes in the Aegean and beyond. But it is important to highlight that there was a moment in the late 1990s, and in that respect, I'd like to comment on what Ambassador Joshkun mentioned about Greece's support for Turkey's EU membership, how sincere it was. There was at least a significant part of the Greek political elite that considered that Turkey's EU membership will make Turkey a better neighbor because it will socialize it to the European political values. So a Turkey which is democratic, liberal, is a Turkey that is more likely to seek a compromise solution on the basis of rule of law with Greece. Of course, the story, we know it didn't go well. Turkey's EU membership perspective failed on a number of reasons, which are not linked to Greek-Turkish relations. Like there were developments in Europe, there were developments in Turkey that kind of made this project unrealistic for the foreseeable future. But it is important to highlight that these Turkey's EU membership perspective provide Greece with a framework of how to address Turkey as a neighbor. To the extent that this relationship has deteriorated, Greece needs to find a new framework in order to deal with Turkey. And if Turkey is becoming more unilateralist and more aggressive, this raises important security concerns. And in that respect, I can understand how Greece's approach to France or the United States means to consolidate Greek security interests and also benefit from the deterioration of Turkish relations with these countries. So I don't think that, for example, the whole discussion about F-35 or F-16s have to do with Greece's sort of manipulations or machinations in the United States. It has to do with certain policies of the Turkish government that gave Greece the opportunity to appear as a more reliable partner to the United States. And of course, that's something that Turkish foreign policy needs to consider, I think, because in other words, it touches upon the question of Turkey's Western identity today. So all these overtures towards Russia, the recent participation in the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization opens all discussions. These are not new issues in Turkish politics, but they were marginal issues. Like 10, 15 years ago, there were some officers that would say, Europe is not the future for us, like let's look into China. There is the future of Turkey. But now this acquires new urgency and raises important questions, and of course, makes countries like Greece think again about their security policy.
Mm. Thank you, Yanis. And I think that this question from the audience is for you. And the question is, do you think Greece is using Turkey's weakness in its weakness in economy, I believe, and Western position, Turkey's strained ties with the West, could these be a factor in the escalating tension. Maybe the Greek prime minister saw a geopolitical environment where maybe seen a weakened Erdogan both at home and on the international stage, and he wanted to utilize that. So that's the question.
Well, I think so. But in addition to that, let me highlight what I said before, that Greece has now acquired some new force coming out from a very difficult decade, and it's tried to position itself again in regional geopolitics. So both in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Balkans, and possibly in the Black Sea as well. So in that respect, the fact that Turkey has had these very bad relations with Israel and Egypt,
yes,
for example, provides Greece with an opportunity. So the signature of the exclusive economic zone agreement between Greece and Egypt is a very good example for that. I don't think that this would have been realistic had Turkey not had these very bad relations with Egypt for reasons independent of Greece.
Ryan, maybe you can address how the United States sees things at this point in time. The US, as you know, has been cultivating closer ties with Greece, and Russian invasion of Ukraine tightened that partnership. The Greek air bases in the north, they've become key in the US and NATO strategy in Ukraine. So I think the level of cooperation between the two countries is at a historic high. And given all that, what has been the US approach or strategy vis-a-vis keeping the Greek-Turkish tension under control? Or you could begin by talking about the Biden administration's Greece policy. You're muted, Ryan. Sorry.
I just wanted to make really two quick points regarding something that just came up, over the discussion just a few moments ago. The first point I would make is, I don't think we should think about this issue as being driven by public opinion. I think, public opinion, in Turkey and in Greece have never been a really big factor in driving conflict. And most conflicts have emanated from top-down decisions. I think, hand in hand with that, I would be a little bit, sort of cautious in thinking too much about this as a kind of a direct result of of elections and electioneering. And I just point really specifically to, I think a sea change within specifically Turkish foreign policy going back a decade, which is increased securitization of foreign policy. And I think we see that in a lot of different venues in and beyond just the Aegean. Now, certainly since post-2016, we've seen the full fruit of this securitization of foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria, but the roots of it go back earlier. And I think that, if we're going to understand the how and the why of where we are today, I think we have to see the fact that when we, look at the way Ankara evaluates problems and sees potential solutions, military force now more than ever is an important part of that. And I think one of the reasons why we have the securitization of foreign policy is because of interinstitutional rivalry and interests. And this is something I've written a fair amount about in terms of the emergence of the Navy as a kind of tip of the spear in dealing with foreign policy issues within the broader region. Now, I mean, to look at sort of where the United States stands within this, I think you have to also somewhat go back a little bit, and perhaps perhaps even as early as the Obama administration, when it became clear that the United States had to rebalance resources within the greater Middle East with an eye towards the Indo-Pacific. And so I would argue that the emergence of a much closer US-Greece relationship, begins first and foremost with that. And I think that, Greece, arguably rather shrewdly, looked upon this need for greater reliance upon NATO partners in an effort to try to offset the rebalancing of US forces between Europe and the Middle East and Asia in beginning to develop these closer relations. And I think, from the US standpoint, and again, these are my opinions. I don't speak for anybody else but myself on this in this regard. My opinion, I think, this wasn't necessarily geared towards, issues specifically with Turkey or even issues specifically dealing with Greece. I think when you have a NATO partner who is quite eager and open in expanding the purview of the relationship, and more specifically wanting greater security cooperation, not just in terms of basing, but also in terms of, the acquisition of new, systems or, or greater arms sales. This is, the United States has trouble turning down yes. This is, a really important part in the ways I think, DoD works and the way the US government works. I mean, I think that, for sure, I mean, the waning of US and Turkish relations, or sort of the difficulties within US-Turkish relations, provide greater incentive in trying to maintain and expand, and rely on this, this emerging relationship. I'm not necessarily sure Washington has any kind of new strategy in terms of trying to manage Turkish-Greek affairs. I think that, to be quite blunt, I think the United States has long struggled with dealing with how to settle disputes between allies. I think there's a core presumption within Washington that, the United States only comes in times of crisis rather than trying to act as a kind of constant, kind of mediator within, or massager of relations in anticipation of crisis, or in anticipation of escalation. So, I mean, I think, more recently, I think this has been dealt with in a rather ad hoc way. Ambassador Choshkin mentioned, the intervention of NATO, going back to, especially to 2020. And I think that, in some ways, this has provided an important means by which the United States can help offset some of these tensions, within the broader framework of NATO. I'm not necessarily sure that this is, part and parcel of a single policy, though.
Ryan, I want to go back to a point that you made. Also, Alper raised this question. This relationship between public opinion and foreign policy, it could be a two-way street. I mean, public opinion could drive foreign policy, but foreign actions on the foreign policy front also could shape public opinion. And I think that reasoning could impact the way Erdogan acts. Maybe, as Alper mentioned, there is not enough nationalist support because people are really worried about everyday issues, bread and butter issues, and all these public opinion polls that everyone, including Yanis, mentioned. People are really focused on what they want to do, what he wants to do with the economy and the Syrian refugees and all. So that is a reality. But on the other hand, Erdogan could drive that nationalist sentiment by an aggressive action on the foreign policy front. Now, my personal view is that he cannot, again, going back to my point about the nationalist base being fragmented, when he launched incursions into Syria, we've seen his support jumped a few points, but it was only for a few months. So it had an impact in terms of mobilizing the nationalists behind his agenda. It wasn't long lasting, but here, this is not 2016, because at the time, the country's nationalists, they were more a uniform entity. But now there's a growing nationalist opposition to Erdogan. And this new nationalism, some call it, this new nationalism, they have different concerns, in a way more sophisticated concerns. Before, the MHP nationalists, the ultra-nationalist party, their nationalism focused on this anti-Kurdish agenda, but now the new nationalists, mostly represented by Good Party, İYİ Party, Meral Akşener's party, for instance, They have economic concerns, they have democratic concerns. So it's not easy to unify them, but it doesn't mean that Erdogan is not going to try.
Yeah, I think that, three quick points. Number one, this begins and ends with Erdogan, what Erdogan thinks and what he thinks would lead to some sort of, victory in 2023. And it's really hard to say, how he's weighing these issues, right? And we have to say that he's in power nearly 20 years. And, how he perceives reality may be very different from you and I. I mean, the other thing I would say is that, I would deduce that there's a fair amount of confidence emanating from the palace that consensus can be created as a result of, a concerted campaign of media intervention, of staging a kind of the context of an event in and beyond just an event unto itself. I mean, it's for this reason that they've invested untold millions into this Ministry of Communication. And the last quick point I would make is that I don't think, this necessarily is thought of as purely an electioneering move. I mean, I think this is, the weight of history here is really quite palpable. We're going into the anniversary of Luzon and the founding of the Turkish Republic. And I think that this issue, perhaps, not just in Erdogan's mind, but within the minds of lots of different individuals across the Turkish political spectrum, this is important. And very quickly, to the question of even the opposition, over the last week, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu gave a rather bellicose statement on the question of the Aegean. So I would necessarily see this as a question of consolidating national consensus. I think this is, more about really galvanizing, the nation around something that I think people generally agree with.
Alper, there's a question for you. How do you think the US could best facilitate reconciliation between Greece and Turkey, especially with respect to Cyprus?
Sure, but I think Yannis wanted to make a quick point. Do you want to go to him first? I can wait. Okay.
Sure. Sorry, Yannis.
No, thank you very much. To follow up to what Ryan just said, I do think, and I agree with Gönül in that these foreign policy adventures have diminishing returns for the government in Turkey. They do apparently have some returns. And the question is whether the government has alternative solutions. If they are just stuck with this option, they may try this. In that respect, like opening a conflict with Greece, I consider to be one of the riskiest options and more difficult options for Turkey. Not only because Greece's diplomatic position, like in the Western security alliances and the European Union, including the upgrade of Greece's defense capabilities in recent years. But I am concerned in light of what's happening in Ukraine, because in a sense, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has broken some very important principles that the international order has been operating. And I'm concerned particularly in the situation in South Caucasus. We had the Azerbaijani aggression against Armenia last week. And this is another topic that can kind of provide the rally around the flag phenomenon effect in Turkey. Like the idea of uniting Azerbaijan, Nakhichevan, and Turkey could become a very dangerous spot. So we need to be concerned about developments on the other side of Turkish borders as well.
Alper?
Sure. At the risk of sounding a little bit naive, I'll argue that Greece and Turkey are so close yet so far. That's really how I felt when I lived in Greece. Both in Turkey and in Greece, you can experience the most extreme views vis-a-vis the other. But I really find those to be in the minority. And coming to the question from Mr. Karapiperis, I do not think that the problems between Turkey and Greece and the situation is irrevocable. No, absolutely not. But it does depend on how politicians will try to or decide to and opt to spin their narratives vis-a-vis each country. Currently, it's not going in the right direction. And I think that's where the problem lies. And that's where I think there's a lot of responsibility. Unless Turkey and Greece boldly decide to break out of their alternative realities vis-a-vis the other, In the Greek eye, Turkey is the aggressor that doesn't respect international law. In the Turkish eye, Greece is violating international law on many islands that are supposed to be demilitarized. The airspace issue, 10 miles that Greece is applying, is recognized internationally as something that is unacceptable, and so on. And the list is long, depending on where you look at it from. But I think the danger that we have now, and both Yannis and Ryan alluded to that, is if the overriding or the mainstream sentiment becomes, either in Turkey or in Greece, that confrontation and escalation is the way to go, then that is definitely worrisome. But I think still, when you look at a number of these surveys, I'm more familiar with the ones in Turkey. When you look at a number of the surveys, there is not an overwhelming push in Turkish society to go to war with Greece. No, on the contrary. And Yannis identified something very important. You know, Turks don't view the Greeks as enemies. In moments in history where there's heightened tension, you will see a greater expression of negative sentiments. So if the spin is more positive on the part of the politicians, and there have been examples of that in the past, I think there's still room for optimism in Turkish-Greek relations, but we are at a difficult inflection point, I think.
So Alper is optimistic, which was nice to hear. What about others? And my last question is, how likely is an armed conflict between Turkey and Greece? Yannis and Ryan, what's your take on that? And I think that covers two of the questions from the audience as well.
Mm-hmm. So despite the escalation, I don't consider such an event as likely in the near future, but this doesn't mean that we shouldn't work hard so that we kind of go past this difficult inflection point, as Ambassador Coşkun mentioned, and try to develop areas whereby dialogue and later possibly cooperation can occur. But it is likely to see more of this as the elections are coming through, because pre-election periods are not easy for such initiatives.
It's low, but it's not improbable. I think it's possible. I think it's certainly possible.
Well, since you gave very brief answers, which was great, I want to ask one more question, and that is, so let's say maybe not an armed conflict, but what will be the implication of current, let's say there's an escalation, and what would be the implication of that escalation for Europe's energy crisis? Could it spell trouble for the EastMed pipeline, or do you see it already at that end? You know, this Eastern Mediterranean, the EastMed pipeline, it holds significant natural gas resources, and the project itself was considered important by the leaders of Greece, Israel, and Cyprus that signed onto the project in early 2020, and the US decided to withdraw its support for the initiative earlier, and basically stating that it was not viable. But I'm still curious, what will be the implication? Let's say if there is an escalation in tensions, what would be the implication of that for Europe's energy crisis?
Like, if I can start,
Sure.
This will mean that there will be very, very limited natural gas resources that will become available to the European market, because escalation in the region is going to mean that companies will be less interested in drilling or investing in the region. And of course, if Turkey goes on with its unilateral acts in the region, this is going to lead to more Cypriot and Greek reactions in the European level, and we may lead to a sanction-based environment, which is going to make things even worse. But let me highlight something that is important, because you talked about the EastMed pipeline. The EastMed pipeline, until the invasion, of course, of Ukraine, met not only economic and engineering difficulties, it also met the decision of the European Union to shift to renewable energy. So this is another parameter that we need to consider. Of course, the war in Ukraine and the urgent need for European natural gas has put this into issue into a new dimension. But I do think that the most realistic scenario for the full monetization of the natural gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean should involve all countries, including Turkey. But this has to happen within a rule of law base, within a framework where the rule of law and international law prevails. Otherwise, it's most likely that it will be like the Aegean, whereby there was one well in Thassos, but no major exploration, and actually the possible Aegean oil fields were never discovered and were never monetized, neither by Greece nor by Turkey nor by anybody.
Anyone else? Last words?
Short answer from me, Gönül. Unless Turkey and Greece and the leadership in both countries forfeits zero-sum game approaches to security, to natural gas, to sharing the revenues and the international dimensions of places like the Aegean Sea, will go nowhere. That mindset has to change. And I think in both countries, there are enough reasonable people that can work on that path without taking it to nationalistic and extreme narratives.
Ryan?
Not on natural gas, no. I mean, I think that, if there's some sort of dramatic escalation, that something just short of war, I think it just, it pushes that much more into new contingencies regarding, further escalation and conflict. And I think that, right now there's a presumption that somehow this the genie can be kept in the bottle. But I think, as time goes on, I think that what we'll see is perhaps the development of, and a reorganization of the exploration and exploitation of energy gas that would, I think exclude Turkey more than include it.
Well, we have to end it there. Thank you so much. This was a great panel, and thanks to those who tuned in to listen to us today. Great discussion. I think we'll continue to talk about Greek-Turkish relations in the coming months. Thank you, and hope to see you next time.